Losing your life partner is devastating. Being thrown off the land you built together is unthinkable. Ranch hand Caleb Vance faces both nightmares on the very same day. His wife's death brings her greedy brothers straight to the Double K Ranch. They mock him, toss his saddlebags into the dirt, and order him gone immediately. As a penniless marry-in, they claim, he has no rights here. Caleb prepares to ride away, heartbroken and homeless, when a mysterious woman intercepts him at the fence. She carries an old, yellowed document. What she reveals will shatter everything these cruel men believe they own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story truly touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is a tale of justice, legacy, and one man's fight to reclaim what was always rightfully his. The Double K Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of Montana grassland. Where the horizons stretched so far, they seemed to touch tomorrow. Caleb Vance had known every inch of this land for 32 years. From the time he first rode through the main gate as a hopeful young ranch hand with nothing but a borrowed horse and worn-out boots. He'd memorized the contours of every hill, knew where the sweetest grazing lay, and could predict the moods of the weather by watching how the cottonwoods bent in the wind. Now, at 58 years old, he stood at the edge of the porch of the foreman's cottage he'd shared with Sarah, his wife of 3 decades. The morning sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, the kind of dawn that used to make Sarah smile and say, "God's showing off again." But Sarah wasn't here to see it. She'd been gone 4 days now, buried in the small cemetery on the eastern ridge where her parents and grandparents rested under weathered headstones. The silence in the cottage felt wrong. For 30 years, these rooms had been filled with Sarah's presence. Her humming while she cooked breakfast, the soft rustle of her turning pages as she read by lamplight, her laughter when Caleb tracked mud across the clean kitchen floor. Now there was only stillness, broken occasionally by the creak of settling timber and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Caleb turned Sarah's wedding ring over in his calloused palm, the simple gold band catching the light. He'd slipped it from her finger just before they closed the casket, unable to bear the thought of it buried in the cold ground. The ring was warm from his body heat, and he could almost imagine it still held some trace of her. She'd worn it every day for 32 years, through all the seasons of their life together, through the struggles and the small triumphs, through the years when they tried and failed to have children, through the quiet acceptance that it would just be the two of them, and that had to be enough. It had been enough, more than enough. Sarah had been his anchor, his home, his reason for staying when the work got hard and the winters got long. She'd been the daughter of the previous ranch owners, and when she chose him, a hired hand with no family name or fortune, her choice had surprised everyone except those who knew her heart. Sarah never cared about status or wealth. She cared about character, about kindness, about a man's willingness to work hard and treat both animals and people with respect. Caleb pocketed the ring and walked down the porch steps. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant pine. His horse, a sturdy quarter horse gelding named Tracker, stood hitched to the rail, already saddled and ready. Caleb had always been an early riser, starting his day before dawn to check the fence lines, move cattle, and handle the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running smoothly. The Double K had been in Sarah's family for 3 generations. Her great-grandfather had established the spread in the 1890s, building it up from a small homestead to one of the most productive cattle operations in the territory. When Sarah's father, Kenneth Kendrick Sr., died 15 years ago, he'd left the ranch to his 3 children, Sarah and her 2 younger brothers, Kenneth Jr. and Marcus. The brothers, who'd long ago moved to cities and careers far from ranch life, had shown little interest in the daily operations. They visited twice a year, inspected the books, collected their share of profits, and returned to their comfortable lives. Sarah had been the one who loved the land, who understood it, who felt the responsibility of stewardship in her bones, and Caleb had loved it because Sarah did, pouring his strength and skill into maintaining what she cherished. But now Sarah was gone, and Caleb could feel the shift in the air like the static charge before a lightning strike. He'd sensed it at the funeral. Kenneth Jr. and Marcus had arrived with their wives, dressed in expensive dark suits that looked out of place against the rough-hewn simplicity of the ranch chapel. They'd been proper enough during the service, but Caleb had caught them exchanging glances, whispering to each other during the reception. When he'd approached to thank them for coming, Kenneth Jr. had looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, more like calculation. "We'll need to talk, Caleb," Kenneth had said, his voice carrying the clipped tones of someone used to boardrooms and business lunches. "About the future, about arrangements." Caleb had nodded. Too grief-stricken to read the warning signs, too focused on putting one foot in front of the other to notice the coldness in Kenneth's eyes. That conversation was scheduled for this morning. Kenneth and Marcus were staying at the main house, the sprawling ranch headquarters where Sarah had grown up. Caleb had been summoned to meet them at 9 o'clock, though he'd arrived early to care for the horses. He knew the meeting wouldn't wait much longer. He led Tracker to the water trough, watching the horse drink deeply. The gelding had been a gift from Sarah 5 years ago, chosen for his steady temperament and sure-footedness. "Every good cowboy needs a reliable partner," she'd said, running her hand along the horse's neck. "And you're the best cowboy I know." The memory sent a fresh wave of grief through Caleb's chest, sharp and sudden as a knife blade. He steadied himself against the trough, taking slow breaths until the feeling passed. Grief came in waves like that, he'd discovered. Sometimes you could go hours feeling almost normal, and then a memory would hit and knock the wind right out of you. From across the yard, he heard boots on gravel. 2 figures approached from the main house, Kenneth Jr. and Marcus, both dressed in jeans that looked too new and boots that had never seen a hard day's work. Behind them, their wives lingered on the main house porch, watching from a distance. "Morning, Caleb," Kenneth called out. His voice had a forced cheerfulness that immediately put Caleb on guard. Marcus said nothing, his face set in an expression that reminded Caleb of their father. Stern and unyielding, used to getting his way. Caleb straightened, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Kenneth, Marcus, I figured we'd talk up at the house." "This won't take long," Kenneth said, stopping a few yards away. "And frankly, it's better if we handle this out here. Less formal." Something cold settled in Caleb's stomach. He'd known these men for decades, had watched them grow from boys to middle-aged men, but standing here now, he realized he'd never really known them at all. They'd always been distant, always treated him as staff rather than family, despite his marriage to their sister. "What's this about?" Caleb asked, though part of him already knew. Kenneth exchanged a glance with Marcus, then pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "We've consulted with our attorneys. According to Montana property law, and according to our father's will, the Double K Ranch is owned equally by the 3 surviving Kendrick children. With Sarah's passing, her share reverts to the estate, to be divided between Marcus and myself as her surviving heirs. That's not how it works," Caleb said quietly. "Sarah and I were married. Community property, you signed a prenuptial agreement 32 years ago." Marcus interrupted, his voice flat and businesslike. "Remember, before the wedding, you waived all claims to Sarah's inheritance and property interests." The memory came back slowly, hazily. He'd been 26, madly in love, and Kenneth Sr. had insisted on the paperwork. Sarah had been apologetic, embarrassed by her father's distrust, but Caleb had signed without hesitation. He hadn't cared about property or inheritance. He'd only cared about Sarah. "I remember," Caleb said, "but I've worked this ranch for 32 years. Sarah and I built a life here. As an employee," Kenneth said, not unkindly but firmly. "You've been well compensated. You've had housing, a salary, and benefits, but you have no ownership stake in the Double K, and with Sarah gone, Marcus and I have decided to make some changes in management." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Caleb gripped Tracker's reins tighter. "What kind of changes?" Marcus stepped forward. "We're selling the Double K to a development company out of Billings. They're offering above market value, and frankly, neither Kenneth nor I have any interest in running a cattle operation. The sale closes in 60 days. "You can't," Caleb said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sarah loved this place. It's been in your family for 3 generations, yes," Kenneth interrupted. "And now it's time for the family to move on. The ranch has served its purpose. The market is right. It's a business decision. What about the cattle? The hands, the contracts with the feed suppliers and the buyers will all be handled by the development company," Marcus said. "They're planning to subdivide the property for luxury home sites. Montana estates for wealthy retirees. They'll keep the main house as a showcase property." Caleb felt his hands shaking. He forced them still, forced his voice to remain calm. And me? Kenneth had the grace to look uncomfortable. You'll need to vacate the foreman's cottage by the end of the week. We'll provide a severance package, 2 months' salary, and a reference letter. That's more than generous, considering the circumstances. The end of the week, Caleb repeated. 5 days. The cottage needs to be cleaned and prepared for showing to potential buyers, Marcus said. The development company wants to stage it as a guest house. For a long moment, Caleb couldn't speak. He looked past the brothers to the land beyond, the rolling pastures, the distant mountains, the big sky that had been his ceiling for 3 decades. This was his home. Not just the cottage, but all of it. Every fence post he'd mended, every calf he'd helped birth, every storm he'd weathered. He'd poured his life into this place, and now, 4 days after burying his wife, they were throwing him out like yesterday's trash. Sarah would be ashamed of you both, Caleb said quietly. Kenneth's face hardened. Sarah's gone, and sentiment doesn't pay the bills or build a future. You're a ranch hand, Caleb. You've always been a ranch hand. Don't confuse marriage to an owner with being an owner yourself. Marcus pulled an envelope from his pocket and held it out. Your severance check, 2 months' salary, as promised. And the reference letter. Caleb didn't take it. He stood there, feeling the weight of 32 years settling on his shoulders like stones. Take it, Marcus said, shaking the envelope slightly. Or don't, but either way, you need to be out of the cottage by Friday evening. We'll have someone come to change the locks on Saturday morning. The casual cruelty of it, delivered in Marcus's flat business voice, broke something loose in Caleb's chest. But he didn't argue. These men had already made their decision. They'd consulted lawyers, arranged sales, planned their future. His presence here was just a final piece of old business to settle. He took the envelope, tucked it into his shirt pocket without looking at it. Friday, he said. Friday. Kenneth confirmed. And Caleb, no hard feelings. This is just business. You understand. But Caleb didn't understand. And as he watched the 2 brothers walk back toward the main house, their expensive boots kicking up dust from his land, from Sarah's land, he felt something harden inside him. Not anger, exactly. Not yet. Just a deep, aching realization that the life he'd built, the home he'd known, was already gone. 3 days later, Caleb loaded the last of his belongings into his saddlebags. Everything he owned in the world fit into 2 weathered leather bags and a bedroll strapped behind Tracker's saddle. 32 years of life reduced to what a horse could carry. He'd spent the past 72 hours in a fog of grief and disbelief, sorting through the cottage, packing his clothes and Sarah's few precious items. Her mother's china teacup, the quilt her grandmother had stitched, the leather-bound journal where she'd written her thoughts. He'd boxed up the photographs from their walls, the small collection of books from her nightstand, the cast-iron skillet she'd used every morning to make his breakfast. Kenneth and Marcus hadn't bothered to check on him. They'd disappeared back to whatever cities claimed them now, leaving their wives to coordinate with the real estate agents and development company representatives who'd already started surveying the property. Caleb had watched them from a distance, these strangers with clipboards and cameras walking his land as if they already owned it. The other ranch hands, 3 younger men who worked the cattle and maintained the equipment, had stopped by to say goodbye. They'd been awkward, uncomfortable, not knowing what to say. The development company had offered them jobs during the transition, so they were staying. Caleb didn't blame them. A man had to eat, but their relief at being kept on only underscored his own displacement. Now, as Friday afternoon sun slanted across the yard, Caleb took one final walk through the cottage. The rooms echoed with emptiness. Someone had already been here. The cleaning crew probably, and removed the curtains Sarah had sewn, the rugs they'd chosen together, even the small wooden cross that had hung above their bed. The cottage had been stripped of anything personal, reduced to bare walls and floors, ready for staging. He stood in the bedroom doorway, remembering Sarah sitting up in bed with her reading lamp on, glasses perched on her nose, lost in whatever book had captured her attention. She'd been a reader. His Sarah always had a book going, usually something about history or biography. She'd loved learning about people's lives, understanding how they'd navigated their challenges. I wish you were here, he said quietly to the empty room. You'd know what to do. But Sarah wasn't here, and Caleb had no plan beyond riding out the main gate and finding work somewhere else. At 58, that wouldn't be easy. Most ranchers wanted younger men, stronger backs, cheaper labor. but he'd figure it out. He always had. He locked the cottage door, a final gesture of respect, though he supposed it didn't matter, and walked to where Tracker waited, patient and ready. The horse nickered softly, sensing Caleb's mood. "I know, boy," Caleb murmured, running his hand along Tracker's neck. "We'll find something. We'll be all right." He swung up into the saddle, settling into leather that had molded to his shape over the years. From up here, he could see across the ranch yard to the main house, where lights glowed in the windows. Somewhere in there, Kenneth and Marcus were probably toasting their successful business deal, counting their money, planning their futures. Caleb turned Tracker toward the main gate, a mile down the gravel road that cut through the heart of the Double K. He didn't look back at the cottage. Looking back only made things harder. The afternoon was cooling into evening, that peculiar Montana light that turned everything golden and soft. His shadow stretched long across the road ahead of him. Cattle grazed in the distant pastures, undisturbed by the changes happening around them. By this time next year, those pastures would probably be carved into lots, stakes driven into ground that had supported 3 generations of Kendrick cattle. Progress, Kenneth had called it. Development, the natural evolution of property use in a changing economy. Caleb called it heartbreak. The main gate came into view, 2 tall posts supporting a wooden cross beam with the Double K brand burned into it. Kenneth Sr. had installed it 40 years ago, and Caleb had repainted the brand every few years to keep it looking sharp. Beyond the gate, the county road stretched in both directions, leading to towns and opportunities he couldn't yet imagine. He was 50 yards from the gate when he noticed the car parked just outside it. A sedan, dark blue, covered in road dust. Someone stood beside it, a woman in a long coat, too formal for ranch country. She was watching the gate, watching him approach, as if she'd been waiting. Caleb slowed Tracker to a walk, instinctively wary. Strangers didn't usually park at the Double K entrance. The ranch was miles from any main highway, down roads that led nowhere except here. As he drew closer, the woman stepped forward. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her coat was wool, city quality, and she carried a leather document case under one arm. "Mr. Vance?" she called out. Her voice was clear, educated, with a hint of Eastern accent. Caleb reined Tracker to a stop 10 feet from the gate. "That's right. Can I help you?" "I hope so," the woman said. "My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm a historical archivist with the Montana State Land Office. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days, but I understand you've been—" She hesitated delicately. "Dealing with personal matters. I buried my wife," Caleb said flatly. "And I'm being evicted. So yes, I've been occupied." Margaret's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Vance. And I'm sorry to intercept you like this, but time is rather critical. I have information you need to see before you leave this property." "Information about what?" "About who actually owns the Double K Ranch." Caleb felt a flicker of irritation. "I know who owns it. Kenneth and Marcus Kendrick. They've made that very clear." "Actually," Margaret said, opening her document case, "they don't own it. They never did, and neither did their father or his father before him." She pulled out a yellowed document, carefully preserved in a clear protective sleeve. Even from horseback, Caleb could see it was old. The paper aged to the color of weak tea. The writing faded, but still legible. "What is that?" he asked. "This," Margaret said, "is the original charter for the Double K Ranch, filed with the Territorial Land Office in 1894. I've spent the past 8 months tracking it down through various archives and county records. It's been misfiled for decades, which is why this situation has gone unnoticed for so long." Caleb dismounted, curiosity overcoming caution. He stepped to the gate, and Margaret passed the document through the fence rails. "Look at the property deed section," she said, pointing to a paragraph near the top of the page. "Right there." Caleb scanned the faded handwriting, struggling with the antiquated script. Then his eyes caught on a name that made his heart skip. "Vance. This property," he read slowly, "comprising approximately 12,000 acres, is hereby leased from the estate of Colonel Jeremiah Vance to Mr. Henry Kendrick for a term of 99 years, commencing January 1st, 1895, and concluding December 31st, 1993. He looked up at Margaret, not understanding. "This is a lease agreement." "Yes," Margaret said. Not a sale, not a deed transfer, a lease for 99 years. But that ended, Caleb did the math quickly, over 30 years ago. 32 years ago, to be precise, Margaret confirmed. On December 31st, 1993. At that point, according to territorial and later state law, the property should have reverted to the Vance estate. But by then, all records of the original lease had been lost or misfiled. The Kendrick family had been paying property taxes and maintaining the land for nearly a century. Everyone assumed they owned it. Caleb's hands were shaking as he held the document. Colonel Jeremiah Vance. That was my great-great-uncle. He disappeared during the Civil War. Family legend said he'd had some land out west, but no one knew where or what happened to it. He died in 1864, Margaret said gently. In a Confederate prison camp. He never returned to claim the property. His estate was administered by his brother, your great-great-grandfather, but records from that period are fragmentary at best. The lease was paid on time every year, so there was no immediate reason to track down heirs. And after 99 years, the property reverts to the Vance estate. Which means, Mr. Vance, that legally you are the rightful owner of the Double K Ranch. The Kendrick family are tenants on an expired lease. They have no legal claim to this land. Caleb stared at the document in his hands, unable to process what he was hearing. It was impossible. It was absurd. It's the truth, Margaret said, reading his expression. I've verified it through multiple sources. The Land Office, State Archives, Federal Records. This document is legitimate, and it supersedes any assumed ownership the Kendricks believe they have. They've been paying taxes for over a century, on property they were leasing, yes. That's not uncommon. Many long-term lease agreements include tax obligations. But it doesn't convey ownership. Caleb looked past Margaret to the ranch stretching behind him, the land he'd just been ordered to leave, the home he'd lost, the legacy he'd thought was gone forever. Why now? He asked. Why come forward now? Because I uncovered this document 3 weeks ago, and it took me this long to track you down and verify your lineage. And because, Margaret checked her watch, it's now 5:17 p.m. on Friday, December 31st. According to Montana property law, if the Kendrick family attempts to sell or transfer this property without clear title, and if a legitimate heir comes forward with proof of ownership, they can be held liable for fraud. You have until midnight tonight to file a claim with the county clerk's office. Midnight, Caleb repeated. After that, the statute of limitations for contesting the transfer becomes much more complicated. But if you file today, you can stop any sale, prevent any transfer, and claim your rightful inheritance. Caleb looked down at the yellowed document, at his great-great-uncle's name written in faded ink, at the date the lease expired, 32 years ago, almost to the day. And slowly, for the first time in a week, he felt something other than grief. He felt hope. Caleb stood at the gate for a long moment, the document trembling in his hand. Around him, the world seemed to have gone very quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I don't understand, he said finally. The Kendricks have lived here for generations. They built the main house, developed the irrigation systems, brought in the first Angus cattle. They developed leased property, Margaret interrupted gently. They improved it, maintained it, and profited from it, yes. But they never owned the mineral rights, water rights, or the land itself. Those remained with the Vance estate. It's all detailed in the charter. Caleb read the document again, more carefully this time. The legal language was dense and archaic, but the meaning was clear enough. His great-great-uncle Jeremiah had owned this land, inherited through some military land grant after the Mexican War. When he'd gone off to fight for the Confederacy, he'd leased it to Henry Kendrick, Sarah's great-grandfather, for 99 years. A century-long lease which would have seemed like forever to men who didn't expect to live to see its end. How did you find this? Caleb asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses. I'm working on a comprehensive survey of territorial land grants for the State Archives. Montana's land ownership history is remarkably complex. Lots of overlapping claims, unclear boundaries, lost documentation. I found the Vance Charter in a box of unsorted military land grants from the 1850s. When I cross-referenced it with current property records, I discovered the discrepancy. And you tracked me down. It took some doing. The Vance family scattered after the Civil War. Your branch moved to Wyoming, then Idaho, then back to Montana. But I found your grandfather's probate records, your father's death certificate, and eventually your marriage license to Sarah Kendrick." She paused. "I'm sorry I didn't reach you sooner. If I had known about her passing—" "You couldn't have known," Caleb said. He looked at his saddlebags, packed with everything he owned, then back at the ranch house, barely visible in the distance. "What do I need to do?" "File a formal claim with the county clerk before midnight. I have all the supporting documentation, the charter, verification of your lineage, confirmation from the state land office, but you'll need proof of identity and family connection. I have my birth certificate in my saddlebag. And," he paused, thinking, "Sarah kept our family Bible. It has records going back 4 generations. It's packed in one of the boxes I loaded this morning." "Perfect. We'll need both. The county clerk's office is in Millstone, about 40 miles from here. If we leave now, we can make it before they close at 7. Caleb hesitated. The enormity of what Margaret was suggesting was beginning to sink in. If he filed this claim, he wouldn't just be fighting for his right to stay. He'd be challenging the Kendrick family's century-old belief that they owned this land. He'd be upending their plans to sell, blocking their deal with the development company, and potentially starting a legal battle that could drag on for years. "They'll fight this," he said. "Probably," Margaret agreed. "They'll hire lawyers, contest the documentation, argue adverse possession or equitable estoppel. But the law's clear, Mr. Vance. You have the superior claim. The Kendrick family never filed for adverse possession during the required period, never sought to convert the lease to ownership, never even acknowledged that a lease existed. They simply assumed ownership over time. Sarah never knew," Caleb said softly. "She would have told me." "I'm sure she didn't. This information has been buried for over a century. There's no reason anyone would have known to look for it." Caleb thought about Sarah, about how much she'd loved this land, about the pride she'd taken in her family's history here. Would she want him to do this? To challenge her brothers, to claim ownership of her family's legacy? But then he remembered Kenneth and Marcus, standing in the yard 3 days ago, treating him like an inconvenient employee to be dismissed with a severance check. He remembered their casual cruelty, their indifference to his grief, their eagerness to sell the land Sarah had cherished. "All right," he said, making the decision. "Let's go to Millstone." Margaret smiled, relief evident on her face. "I'll drive. Your horse can be hitched to the trailer on my truck. It's parked just down the road." 20 minutes later, Tracker was secured in Margaret's horse trailer, and Caleb was riding shotgun in her truck. The charter document and his family papers spread across his lap. The evening sun cast long shadows across the highway as they drove toward Millstone, passing through small towns and open country. Margaret drove with the confidence of someone who'd spent years navigating Montana's rural roads. "Tell me about your family," she said. "What do you know about Jeremiah Vance?" "Not much," Caleb admitted. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the Vance side of the family. Said we'd had some land out west before the war, but it was lost somehow. She thought it had been seized when Jeremiah fought for the Confederacy, or sold for taxes. Nobody knew the details. By the time I was born, the family was working ranches in Wyoming. We were never owners, always hands." "Did your father ever mention the Double K?" "He died when I was 12. Ranch accident. A horse spooked and threw him. He hit his head on a fence post. The old pain was still there. Buried but never quite healed. After that, my mother worked as a cook on various spreads. I started working cattle as soon as I was old enough to sit a horse properly. And you ended up here." "Saw a job posting in a ranch supply store. The Double K was looking for seasonal help. I came for a summer and never left." He touched the pocket where he kept Sarah's ring. "I found something worth staying for." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. The sky was deepening to purple, early stars beginning to emerge. Caleb watched the landscape roll past, thinking about his great-great-uncle Jeremiah, a man he'd never met, whose decisions over a century ago were about to change everything. "What was he like?" Caleb asked. "Jeremiah. Did you find any records about him?" Margaret nodded. "Some. He was a military man, a colonel in the army before the Civil War. Fought in the Mexican War, was wounded twice but survived. Received his land grant in 1852 as payment for his service. He was 43 when the Civil War started. He sided with the Confederacy. He'd been born in Virginia and joined up despite his age. He was captured at Shiloh in 1862, sent to a prison camp in Illinois. He died there of typhoid in 1864. Did he have family? A wife who died in childbirth in 1858. No surviving children. His brother, your great-great-grandfather, was his only heir, but the brother had moved back east and never claimed the western property. I suspect he didn't even know about the lease arrangement. By the time the 99 years were up, everyone who might have known was long dead. Caleb looked down at the charter, at Jeremiah's signature, a firm, clear hand that spoke of confidence and authority. This man, this stranger from the past, had built something here. He'd secured this land, dreamed his own dreams for it, and then lost everything to war and death and time. But the land remained. And now, through a twist of fate and an archivist's diligence, that land was coming back to the Vance family. "We're almost there," Margaret said, pointing to lights ahead. The town of Millstone spread across a valley, its main street marked by the glow of street lamps and storefronts. Caleb checked his watch. 6:35. They had just over an hour to file the claim. His hands, resting on the old document, were steady now. Whatever came next, whatever fight Kenneth and Marcus brought, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face it. Sarah's ring pressed against his chest through his shirt pocket, and he could almost hear her voice. "Stand up for yourself, Caleb. Stand up for what's right." He was about to do exactly that. The Millstone County Clerk's office occupied the first floor of an old stone building that had served as the courthouse since territorial days. Margaret pulled into the parking lot at 6:42, giving them 18 minutes before closing time. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh illumination on scuffed linoleum floors and walls lined with filing cabinets. A young clerk sat behind a wooden counter, clearly preparing to close up for the day. She looked up as they entered, surprise crossing her face at the sight of visitors so late on a Friday evening. "We're about to close," she said, not unkindly but firmly. "I understand," Margaret said, approaching the counter with the document case. "But we need to file a time-sensitive property claim. It's critical that it's filed today." The clerk glanced at the wall. "Clock, what kind of claim?" "A claim of rightful ownership based on historical charter and lease expiration. This is Mr. Caleb Vance, and this—" She carefully removed the charter from its protective sleeve. "His documentation proving his ownership of the Double K Ranch." The clerk's eyes widened slightly. The Double K was known throughout the county, one of the largest and most established ranches in the region. "I'll need to get Mr. Hartley. He handles all the complex property filings." She disappeared through a door behind the counter. Caleb could hear low voices, then footsteps. A moment later, an older man emerged, perhaps 65, with a weathered face and careful eyes. He wore a sheriff's badge on his shirt. "I'm Sheriff Hartley," he said. "Linda says you're filing a property claim on the Double K." "That's correct," Margaret said. She introduced herself and Caleb, then launched into a concise explanation of the charter, the lease expiration, and Caleb's lineage. She spread the documents across the counter, the original charter, verification letters from the State Land Office, copies of Vance family records, Caleb's birth certificate, and the family Bible with its careful notations of births, marriages, and deaths going back generations. Sheriff Hartley examined each document with the slow, methodical attention of a man who'd learned not to rush judgment. He read the charter twice, checked the dates, verified the signatures against known examples from the territorial archives. "This is legitimate," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "I've spent 8 months verifying every detail. Mr. Vance is the rightful heir to the Vance estate, and the Vance estate holds superior title to the Double K Ranch. The Kendricks aren't going to like this," Hartley said, looking at Caleb with something like sympathy. "I know," Caleb said, "but it's the truth. They've been good to their word about the lease payments, maintained the land well, but the lease expired 32 years ago. The property should have reverted to my family then." "Why didn't it?" "Nobody knew," Margaret interjected. "The original charter was misfiled. The Kendrick family had been managing the property for so long, paying taxes and maintaining ownership records, that everyone, including county and state officials, simply assumed they held clear title. But assumption isn't the same as legal ownership." Hartley nodded slowly. "Kenneth Kendrick, the one who lives back east, was in here 2 weeks ago, filed papers for a property sale to some development company. Said it would close in 60 days. That sale cannot proceed," Margaret said firmly. "Not without clear title, which the Kendricks don't have. If they attempt to complete that sale, knowing that a legitimate heir has filed a claim, they could be charged with fraud. Have they been notified of this claim?" "Not yet. According to statute, They have to be formally served. Within 72 hours of filing, but the filing itself is what stops the sale. Hartley drummed his fingers on the counter, thinking. Then he looked at Caleb. You understand what you're starting here. The Kendricks are wealthy, connected. They'll fight this with everything they have. I understand, Caleb said, but it's my land. My great-great-uncle's land. And I'm not letting them sell it out from under me without a fight. Something in Hartley's expression shifted. A small nod of respect. All right, let's get this filed properly. Linda, bring me the property claim forms. I want every detail documented correctly. For the next 40 minutes, they worked through the paperwork. Caleb signed form after form, each one witnessed and notarized by Hartley himself. Margaret provided supporting documentation for each claim, building an airtight legal case. Linda, the young clerk, made careful copies of everything, filing them in multiple locations as Hartley directed. At 7:37, Hartley stamped the final document with an official seal. Property claim filed as of today's date. I'll have the formal notice prepared for service tomorrow morning. The Kendricks will be notified by Monday at the latest. He handed Caleb a folder containing copies of all the filed documents, including one with the official county stamp. Keep these safe. You're going to need them. Caleb took the folder, feeling its weight. Not just the paper, but the responsibility it represented. This was real now. Official. There was no taking it back. What happens next? He asked. The Kendricks have 30 days to respond to the claim, Hartley explained. They can contest it, provide counter-evidence, or accept the judgment. Given the strength of your documentation, I'd expect them to contest. That means it goes before a county judge, possibly appeals court if they push it that far. Could take months, maybe years, to fully resolve. In the meantime, the property is under dispute. No sale can proceed, no transfer of title can occur, and no one can be evicted from the property without a court order. That means you, Mr. Vance. You have every right to remain on the Double K until this is settled. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. Tension he'd been carrying for days without realizing it. He wasn't homeless anymore. He had legal standing, documentation, rights. He had a home again. Thank you, he said to Hartley, then to Margaret. Thank you both, Margaret smiled. I'll be returning to the capital tomorrow, but I've provided my contact information in your file. If you need me to testify or provide additional documentation, just call. They walked out into the cool evening air. The town was quiet, most businesses closed for the night. Caleb stood on the courthouse steps, breathing deeply, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 3 hours. What will you do now? Margaret asked. Go back to the Double K, Caleb said. Unpack my things and wait for the storm. It will be a storm, Margaret warned. Kenneth and Marcus will be furious. They'll feel betrayed, tricked, cheated out of their inheritance. They'll feel what I felt when they threw me out, Caleb said quietly. The difference is, I have the law on my side. They drove back through the darkness, Tracker steady in the trailer behind them. By the time they reached the Double K gate, it was after 9 o'clock. Margaret helped Caleb unhitch Tracker and unload his belongings. Good luck, she said, shaking his hand. You're doing the right thing. I hope so, Caleb replied. He watched her drive away, taillights disappearing down the county road. Then he turned back to the ranch, his ranch now, legally if not yet practically, and led Tracker through the gate. The foreman's cottage sat dark and empty in the distance. Caleb had been ordered out, had packed his life into saddlebags, had been ready to ride away forever. But that was before Margaret Halloway and her yellowed document. That was before he learned the truth about who really owned this land. He unsaddled Tracker in the barn, giving the horse extra oats and a thorough brushing. The familiar routine calmed his racing thoughts. Then, carrying his saddlebags and the folder of legal documents, he walked back to the cottage. The door was still unlocked from earlier. He pushed it open and stepped inside, flipping on lights. The bare rooms looked different now, not like a place he was leaving, but like a place waiting to be reclaimed. He unpacked slowly, methodically, hung his clothes in the closet, placed Sarah's china teacup on the kitchen shelf, set the family Bible on the nightstand where it had always lived, retrieved the boxes he'd packed earlier from where he'd stashed them in the barn, bringing back the photographs, the quilts, the small accumulations of a life shared. By midnight, the cottage looked like home again. Caleb stood at the bedroom window, looking out across the darkened ranch. Somewhere out there, Kenneth and Marcus were sleeping peacefully, believing they'd handle their business, dismiss their problem, secure their future tomorrow, or Monday at the latest. They'd learn the truth. Caleb touched the folder of legal documents on the dresser, then Sarah's wedding ring in his pocket. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly to her memory. "I'm staying. I'm fighting. This is our home." And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something solid beneath his feet, something to stand on, something worth defending. The confrontation came on Monday morning, exactly as Caleb had expected. He'd spent the weekend working around the ranch, falling back into his familiar routines. The other hands had been surprised to see him, but said nothing. They'd learned long ago that ranch politics were above their pay grade. Caleb had checked fence lines, moved cattle to fresh pasture, and repaired a gate hinge that had been bothering him for weeks. Normal work, soothing work, the kind that let his mind settle while his hands stayed busy. Kenneth and Marcus arrived at 8 o'clock, their rental car kicking up dust as it barreled down the main road from the house. They parked hard outside the foreman's cottage, car doors slamming with enough force to startle the chickens scratching in the yard. Caleb was on the porch, sipping coffee from Sarah's favorite mug. He'd known this moment was coming. Sheriff Hartley had called Sunday evening to confirm that the legal notices had been delivered to the main house that afternoon by a deputy. The Kendricks had been served. Kenneth stormed up the porch steps, his face flushed with anger. He was holding a sheaf of papers, the legal notice, and he looked like he wanted to set them on fire. Marcus followed 2 steps behind, his expression colder but equally furious. "What the hell is this?" Kenneth demanded, shaking the papers at Caleb. "What kind of game are you playing?" Caleb set down his coffee carefully. "It's not a game. It's a legal property claim, properly filed with the county clerk's office. This is insane. You can't possibly think. This document you've dredged up, this supposed charter, it's over 100 years old. It's meaningless. It's legally binding," Caleb said calmly. "The state land office has verified its authenticity. Your great-grandfather leased this land from my great-great-uncle for 99 years. That lease expired in 1993. The property reverted to the Vance estate, which means it reverted to me." Marcus stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled rage. "We've owned this land for 4 generations. We've paid taxes, maintained the property, invested millions in improvements. You have no right." "I have every right," Caleb interrupted. "Legal right, documented and filed. You're the ones who don't have clear title. You've been living on and profiting from property you never owned. This is extortion." Kenneth spat. "You're trying to shake us down, use Sarah's death to manipulate us into—" "What? Paying you off? Giving you a cut of the sale?" The accusation stung, but Caleb kept his voice level. "I'm not shaking anyone down. I'm claiming what's legally mine, what's been mine, my family's, for over a century. Your family abandoned this land," Marcus shot back. "Jeremiah Vance died in a prison camp. His brother never came forward, never paid a single dollar in taxes, never lifted a finger to maintain the property. If anyone has a claim through adverse possession, it's us. We've held this land openly and continuously for over 100 years, but you never filed for adverse possession during the required period," Caleb said. "And you can't claim it now. The statute of limitations expired decades ago." Kenneth's hands were shaking with fury. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? We have a sale contract with Pinnacle Development. They're paying $18 million for this property. If that sale doesn't go through because of your ridiculous claim, they'll sue us for breach of contract. We could lose everything. Then you shouldn't have tried to sell property you don't own," Caleb said quietly. The words hung in the morning air like a challenge. Kenneth looked like he wanted to hit something or someone. Marcus grabbed his brother's arm, holding him back. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice deadly calm now. "We have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, connections, money. We will fight this claim with everything we have. We'll tie you up in court for years. You'll spend every penny you have, every penny you'll ever have, and you'll still lose." "Maybe," Caleb acknowledged. "But until a court rules otherwise, I'm the legal owner of this property, which means you can't sell it, can't transfer it, and can't evict me from it." "You're still living in the foreman's cottage," Kenneth said, grasping for some sense of control. "That's ranch property. I can have the sheriff. The sheriff already knows about the claim," Caleb said. "He filed it himself, and until ownership is determined, I have every right to remain here. This is my home. It's been my home for 32 years, and I'm not leaving." Kenneth pulled out his phone. We'll see what our lawyers say about that. By end of business today, you'll be served with a counterclaim, and we'll be seeking damages for the interference with our sale contract. Do what you need to do, Caleb said. I'm not going anywhere. The brothers stood there for another moment, fury radiating from both of them. Then Marcus turned sharply, heading back to the car. Kenneth followed, but paused at the bottom of the porch steps. Sarah would be ashamed of you, he said. Using her death to steal her family's property. She married beneath her, and you just proved everyone right about you. The words were meant to wound, and they did. But Caleb didn't let it show. Sarah loved this land more than anything except maybe the truth. And the truth is what I'm standing on. Your family has been good tenants for 4 generations, but tenants is all you ever were. Kenneth's face twisted with contempt. He climbed into the car without another word. The vehicle roared to life and sped back toward the main house, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in its wake. Caleb sat back down, his coffee now cold. His hands were trembling slightly, adrenaline and anger mixing in his veins. He'd known the confrontation was coming, had prepared himself for it, but the venom in Kenneth's words still shook him. One of the younger ranch hands, a man named Tommy, appeared around the corner of the barn. He'd clearly been watching from a distance, waiting for the storm to pass. "Everything all right, boss?" Tommy asked carefully. "I'm not your boss," Caleb said automatically. "Well, somebody is. And right now it looks like it might be you," Tommy grinned. "Word's gotten around about what you filed. The Kendricks can say what they want, but the hands all know you've got the stronger claim. We've been wondering when someone would call them on their high-handed ways." Caleb looked at the young man with surprise. "You don't think I'm in the wrong for claiming what's legally yours?" "No, sir. Most of us have been here long enough to see how they treated you after Miss Sarah passed. That wasn't right. You built this place as much as anyone, and they threw you out like trash. If you've got legal grounds to push back, well," Tommy shrugged. "Seems like justice to me." It was a small vote of confidence, but it meant more than Caleb wanted to admit. He wasn't entirely alone in this fight. "Thanks, Tommy." "Yes, sir. You need anything, you let us know." The young man headed back to work, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. He looked out across the ranch. The land that had been his home, that was now legally his property, at least until the courts said otherwise. Kenneth was right about one thing. They would fight with everything they had. Lawyers, money, connections. They'd drag this through every court, appeal every decision, make his life as difficult as possible. But Caleb had something they didn't. He had the truth, and he had nothing left to lose. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Vance, this is Richard Chen from the law firm of Chen & Associates. Margaret Halloway provided me with your contact information. I specialize in property rights cases, and I'd like to offer my services pro bono. Your case is exactly the kind of historical justice claim I find compelling." Caleb felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. "I appreciate that, Mr. Chen. I have a feeling I'm going to need a good lawyer. From what Margaret told me, you have an excellent case. I've already reviewed the documentation she provided. The Kendricks can challenge all they want, but the law is unambiguous. I'd be honored to represent you." They talked for another 20 minutes. Chen outlining the likely progression of the case and what Caleb could expect. By the time they hung up, Caleb felt more prepared, more confident. He finished his cold coffee in one long swallow, then stood and stretched. There was work to do. Cattle to check, equipment to maintain, a life to rebuild. The fight was just beginning. But for the first time in weeks, Caleb felt like he was fighting for something instead of just surviving loss. Sarah's ring pressed against his chest, warm from his body heat, and he could almost hear her voice. "Stand your ground, Caleb. Stand your ground." That's exactly what he intended to do. The town of Millstone had always been small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and the dispute over the Double K Ranch became the biggest news in years. Within days, opinions had divided sharply. Some folks sided with the Kendricks, believing that a century of stewardship counted for more than an old piece of paper. Others saw Caleb's claim as rightful justice, a working man finally getting what was owed to him. Caleb discovered this firsthand when he drove into town the following Saturday for supplies. At the feed store, old Frank Morrison shook his hand firmly and said, "About time someone stood up to those city boys." At the diner, though, the waitress, a woman whose sister worked as housekeeper for the Kendricks, served his coffee with barely concealed hostility. The division followed him everywhere. Some people saw him as a hero reclaiming his legacy. Others viewed him as an opportunist using a technicality to steal from a respected family. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Richard Chen, his new attorney, called that evening with updates. The Kendricks have hired Whitmore and Associates out of Billings. They're one of the most expensive firms in the state, specializing in property disputes. They've filed their counterclaim, arguing adverse possession and equitable estoppel. What does that mean? Caleb asked. It means they're claiming that because they've held and improved the property for over a century, openly and without challenge, they've acquired ownership through continuous possession. Equitable estoppel means they're arguing it would be unfair to strip them of property they've invested in based on their good faith belief they owned it. Can they win on those grounds? It's possible, but unlikely. Adverse possession requires a specific timeline and conditions, none of which were met in this case. And good faith doesn't override clear legal title. But they'll make it messy and expensive. Chen paused. There's something else. They're claiming emotional damages, saying your claim has caused them severe distress and damaged their reputation in the business community. Caleb felt a flash of anger. They threw me out 4 days after I buried my wife. They want to talk about emotional distress? I know. We'll address that in our response. But be prepared. This is going to get personal before it gets better. After the call, Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun set over the western pastures. The ranch felt different now, weighted with conflict and uncertainty. The other hands still did their work, but there was tension in the air, an awareness that everything could change depending on how the courts ruled. He'd been going through Sarah's belongings, sorting what to keep and what to let go. In a box of her mother's things, he'd found something unexpected. A bundle of old letters tied with faded ribbon. Most were correspondence between Sarah's grandmother and various family members, but one letter stood out. It was addressed to Henry Kendrick, Sarah's great-grandfather, dated April 1895. The return address was simply J. Vance, Double K Ranch. Caleb had opened it carefully, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was the same as the signature on the charter, firm and clear, written with an educated hand. The letter read, Mr. Kendrick, I write to confirm receipt of your payment for the current year of the lease. I trust the land continues to serve you well and that your cattle prosper on it. I regret that I cannot visit the property myself, as my health no longer permits such travel. The war years took much from me, but I find some solace in knowing that the land I once cherished is in capable hands. The lease, as you know, extends for 99 years from our original agreement. I expect my descendants, should I have any, will one day reclaim the property when the term concludes. Until then, I remain your landlord in name, if not in presence. Respectfully, Colonel J. Vance. The letter was a revelation. Jeremiah Vance hadn't forgotten about the land. He'd maintained contact, collected lease payments, and explicitly expected his descendants to reclaim it. There was no ambiguity, no suggestion that he intended to let the property go permanently to the Kendricks. Caleb had brought the letter to Richard Chen the next day. The lawyer's eyes had lit up when he read it. This is gold, Chen said. It proves ongoing awareness of the lease arrangement and clear intent for the property to revert to Vance heirs. The Kendricks can't claim they had no knowledge of the lease if their own ancestor was receiving letters acknowledging it. Will it help the case? Immeasurably. It undermines their entire adverse possession argument. You can't claim something openly and hostilely if you're acknowledging the true owner's superior claim in writing. But even with this evidence, Caleb found himself wrestling with doubts. Late at night, lying in the bed he'd shared with Sarah, he wondered if he was doing the right thing. The Kendricks had indeed improved the property, built the main house, developed the irrigation, brought in quality cattle. They'd treated the land well, even if they'd treated him poorly, and Sarah had loved her brothers, despite their flaws. She'd made excuses for them, hoped they'd mature, always believed there was good in them somewhere. Would she want him fighting them like this? But then he'd remember Kenneth's sneer. You married beneath her, and you just proved everyone right about you. He'd remember Marcus tossing his saddlebags in the dirt. He'd remember being ordered off land he'd sweated and bled for, being dismissed like he'd never mattered. No, Sarah would understand. She'd been furious when her father insisted on the prenuptial agreement all those years ago. She'd argued that marriage should be a true partnership, not a business arrangement. She'd believed in fairness and justice, even when it cut against her own family's interests. On a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after filing his claim, Caleb received an unexpected visitor, a man in his 70s. Dressed in a well-worn suit, drove up to the cottage and introduced himself as Walter Brennan, a retired judge from the district court. "I heard about your case," Brennan said, settling into the chair Caleb offered on the porch. "Fascinating situation. I reviewed some of the public filings. Hope you don't mind. And I wanted to tell you something." "What's that?" "I presided over a similar case about 20 years ago. Different property, different families, but the same basic issue. A long-expired lease and disputed ownership. The leaseholder family had been on the land for 80 years, made improvements, paid taxes. They argued they'd earned ownership through stewardship. What happened? The court ruled for the original owner's heir. The law was clear then, and it's clear now. A lease is a lease, no matter how long it runs. When it expires, the property reverts. Unless specific legal steps are taken to convert it to ownership, and those steps have strict time frames, possession doesn't create title." Caleb felt some of his doubt ease. "The Kendricks say they'll appeal it all the way to the state Supreme Court if they have to. They probably will, but they'll lose. The law isn't on their side, no matter how much money they throw at lawyers." Brennan stood, preparing to leave. "I also wanted to tell you, what you're doing takes courage. Standing up to powerful people, claiming what's rightfully yours. That's not easy, especially in a community like this where everyone has an opinion. Some days I'm not sure if it's courage or stubbornness." Brennan smiled. "The best kind of courage usually looks like stubbornness from the outside. You stay strong, Mr. Vance. Justice doesn't always come easy, but it's worth fighting for." After Brennan left, Caleb walked out to the eastern ridge where Sarah was buried. He'd been coming here every few days, sitting by her headstone, talking to her like she could still hear him. "I met your great-great-grandfather today," he said, settling onto the grass. "Well, through his letter anyway. Jeremiah Vance. He was a soldier, a man of principle. He loved this land, but went off to fight for what he believed in. Lost everything in that war. His wife, his health, his future. But he never gave up on the idea that this land would come back to his family." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers. "I know your brothers think I'm betraying you by fighting them, but I hope you'd understand. This isn't about revenge or greed. It's about standing up for what's right. About honoring the legacy of people like Jeremiah, who sacrificed everything. And about honoring you, Sarah. You taught me that kindness doesn't mean being a doormat. That love doesn't require letting people walk all over you." He touched her headstone, the marble smooth and cool under his palm. "I'm going to see this through, whatever it takes. For Jeremiah, for you, for me." The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Caleb stood, dusting off his jeans, and walked back down the ridge toward home. His home, legally, rightfully. Finally, his home. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Caleb had been working in the main barn on a Thursday morning, repairing a section of stall where the wood had rotted through. The work was hot and tedious, but he found comfort in physical labor, something concrete and controllable when everything else felt uncertain. He was prying up old floorboards when Tommy, the young ranch hand, came running in, breathless with excitement. "Boss, you need to come see this, right now." Caleb set down his crowbar. "What is it? Just come. It's in the old tack room behind the main house. We were cleaning it out like the Kendricks ordered. Getting ready for the sale, even though the sale ain't happening. And we found something big." The tack room was a small stone building that had been part of the original ranch structures, built back in the 1890s. It was rarely used anymore, filled with decades of accumulated junk, broken saddles, rusty tools, moth-eaten blankets. The Kendricks had ordered it cleaned out as part of staging the property for sale. Inside, 2 other hands were standing around an old wooden trunk that had been pulled from behind a pile of moldy hay bales. The trunk was made of heavy oak, bound with iron straps, and covered in dust so thick it looked like gray felt. "We almost threw it out," Tommy said. "Figured it was just more junk. But then Manuel pried it open and, well, you'll see." The trunk's lid had been forced open, the old lock broken. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, were documents, dozens of them, neatly organized, and remarkably well preserved. Caleb knelt down, carefully removing the top layer. What he saw made his breath catch. The documents were lease payment records, meticulously maintained ledgers showing annual payments from Henry Kendrick to Jeremiah Vance, then later to Jeremiah's brother, then to his brother's estate. The payments continued for 67 years, from 1895 to 1962. After 1962, there were no more payment records, just a handwritten note dated December 1962 in what looked like Kenneth Sr.'s handwriting. Payment recipient deceased. No known heirs located. Continue tax payments and property maintenance under assumed ownership. Legal consultation advised lease term expiration in 1993. Consult attorneys regarding title conversion before expiration date. Caleb read the note 3 times, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a forgotten lease. Kenneth Sr., Sarah's father, had known about it. He'd known the lease would expire, and he'd been advised to convert the title legally before that happened. But apparently, he never did. "There's more," Tommy said, pulling out another bundle of papers. Letters from attorneys, going back to the 1960s. Look at this one. The letter was dated March 1987 from a law firm in Helena. It was addressed to Kenneth Kendrick Sr., and it laid out in stark legal terms what needed to be done. File for adverse possession, establish a quiet title action, document continuous occupation and improvement, and formalize ownership before the 1993 expiration date. There were follow-up letters from the same firm in 1989, 1991, and a final one in January 1993, just weeks before the lease expired. Each letter grew more urgent, warning that failure to act would result in the property reverting to the Vance estate. And at the bottom of the trunk, in a sealed envelope marked "Confidential," was a legal memo dated February 1993. It confirmed that the lease had expired, that no title conversion had been completed, and that the Kendrick family's continued occupation of the property was legally questionable and potentially fraudulent if ownership is claimed without clear title. The memo advised immediate action to locate Vance heirs and negotiate a sale or new lease agreement. It warned that concealing the lease expiration and attempting to sell the property as if they held clear title could constitute fraud. Kenneth Sr. had never followed that advice. Instead, he'd apparently hidden these documents, continued to claim ownership, and passed the property to his children as if it had always been theirs. Caleb sat back on his heels, stunned. This wasn't just a forgotten technicality. This was deliberate concealment. The Kendricks, or at least Kenneth Sr., had known they didn't own the Double K. They'd been advised by their own attorneys to resolve the situation legally, and they'd chosen instead to bury the evidence and hope no one ever found it. "What does this mean?" Manuel asked quietly. "It means," Caleb said slowly, "that the Kendricks' claim of good faith is destroyed. They can't argue they innocently believed they owned the property. Their own father knew the truth and chose to hide it." Tommy let out a low whistle. "That's fraud, isn't it? Like criminal fraud?" "I don't know about criminal," Caleb said, "but it's definitely legal fraud. Selling property you know you don't own. That's a whole different level from mistakenly selling property you think you own." He pulled out his phone and called Richard Chen. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "Richard, I need you to come to the ranch. Today, if possible. We've found documents that change everything." Chen arrived 3 hours later, driving straight from Billings. Caleb led him to the tack room, where the trunk and its contents were exactly as they'd been found. Chen spent an hour carefully examining each document, photographing everything with his phone, making notes on a legal pad. Finally, he looked up at Caleb with an expression of amazed satisfaction. "This is devastating to their case. Absolutely devastating. Not only does it prove they knew about the lease, it proves they were specifically advised to resolve the title issue legally and chose not to. And this memo," he held up the 1993 document, "this explicitly warns them about fraud if they claim ownership without clear title. What happens now? Now we file an amended complaint, adding claims of fraud and concealment. We present these documents as evidence, and we ask the court for sanctions against the Kendricks for bringing a frivolous counterclaim when they knew they had no legal standing. Can they claim they didn't know, that their father hid this from them too? They can try. But look at this." Chen pulled out another document, A letter dated 1995, 2 years after Kenneth Sr.'s death. It was from the same Helena law firm to Kenneth Jr. and Marcus, informing them that their father's estate included the Double K Ranch property, subject to expired lease agreements and unresolved title questions that should be addressed with legal counsel. They knew, Chen said flatly. Or they should have known. Their own estate attorney told them there were title issues. They chose to ignore it. Caleb felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. He'd known Kenneth and Marcus for decades. They'd never been warm to him, never treated him as true family, but he'd never thought they were capable of outright fraud. Now he had to confront the reality that they'd been willing to sell property they knew wasn't theirs, to take $18 million for land they'd been warned they didn't legally own. What about their sale to the development company? Caleb asked. If that sale had gone through, if we hadn't filed your claim when we did, they would have collected $18 million for property they had no right to sell. The development company would have discovered the title defect eventually, likely after they'd already started development. The legal liability would have been enormous. They would have bankrupted the development company, or at least cost them millions in losses. Yes, Chen started carefully packing the documents back into the trunk. We need to preserve this evidence. I'm going to have it transported to a secure location, photographed professionally, and authenticated by a documents expert. This trunk and everything in it is going to win your case, Caleb. After Chen left, Caleb walked back to the cottage, his mind reeling. The case he'd thought might drag on for years could now be resolved in months, maybe even weeks. The Kendricks' entire defense had just collapsed. But there was no joy in the discovery, only a deep weariness. He thought about Sarah, about how she would have reacted to learning her father had knowingly concealed the truth, had passed on a lie to his children. It would have broken her heart. He pulled out her wedding ring, holding it up to catch the afternoon light. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said quietly. I know they're your family. I know this is going to hurt them. But the truth matters. You taught me that. The truth always matters, even when it's painful. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about all the twists his life had taken. 3 months ago, he'd been a happily married ranch foreman, living a simple life on land he loved. Then Sarah died, and he'd lost everything, or thought he had. Then Margaret Halloway appeared with her yellowed charter, offering hope and justice. And now this. Proof that the Kendricks had known all along. Proof that their righteousness was built on lies, their inheritance on concealment, their plans on fraud. The truth had been buried in a trunk in an old tack room for 60 years, waiting to be discovered. And 3 young ranch hands, cleaning out junk in preparation for a sale that would never happen, had found it. Sometimes, Caleb thought, justice works in strange and unexpected ways. Sometimes the truth hides for decades, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And sometimes a man who's lost everything finds out he had more than he knew all along. He touched Sarah's ring one more time, then set it on the nightstand and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, for the first time since her death, he felt like he could breathe again. The county courthouse in Millstone had seen its share of disputes over the years, but nothing quite like the Vance versus Kendrick case. By the morning of the hearing, news crews from 3 different cities had set up cameras outside, and the courtroom gallery was packed with local residents eager to witness the showdown. Caleb sat at the plaintiff's table beside Richard Chen, wearing the one suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral. It felt strange to be dressed formally in a place that had always been about jeans and boots, but Chen had insisted. Appearances mattered in court, he'd said, and they needed to present Caleb as a man of dignity and substance. Across the aisle, Kenneth and Marcus sat with their legal teams. 4 attorneys from Whitmore and Associates, all dressed in expensive suits and projecting an air of confident superiority. Kenneth glanced over once, his face a mask of cold hatred. Marcus kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched tight. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of legal maneuvering. After Chen filed the amended complaint with evidence of fraud and concealment, the Kendricks' attorneys had gone into damage control mode. They'd tried to have the trunk documents excluded as evidence, arguing they'd been obtained improperly. The judge had rejected that argument. The documents had been found by ranch employees doing legitimate work on property under dispute. Then they'd tried to argue that Kenneth Sr. had acted alone, that his sons had no knowledge of the concealment. But Chen had destroyed that defense by presenting the 1995 letter from the estate attorney, along with email correspondence from 2010 showing Marcus and Kenneth discussing the title issue Dad mentioned and agreeing to keep it quiet and hope it never comes up. Now, with their backs against the wall, the Kendricks were taking a different approach. Through their attorneys, they'd requested a pre-trial conference to discuss settlement. The judge had agreed, scheduling it for this morning before the formal hearing. Judge Patricia Morland entered the courtroom and everyone stood. She was a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd reviewed all the filings, read all the evidence and, according to Chen, was known for her no-nonsense approach to property disputes. "Be seated," she said, settling into her chair behind the bench. "Before we begin formal proceedings, I understand both parties have expressed interest in discussing settlement. Mr. Whitmore, you requested this conference. What are you proposing?" The lead Kendrick attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Whitmore, stood. "Your Honor, my clients recognize that there are complications regarding the title history of the Double K Ranch. In the interest of avoiding protracted litigation, they're prepared to offer Mr. Vance a substantial settlement." "How substantial?" the judge asked. $3 million, paid immediately, in exchange for Mr. Vance withdrawing his claim and signing a quit-claim deed to the property. Caleb felt his breath catch. $3 million. More money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes of ranch work. Enough to buy his own land somewhere else. Start over, live comfortably for the rest of his days. Chen leaned over and whispered, "Don't react. Let me handle this." The attorney stood. "Your Honor, while my client appreciates the Kendricks' recognition of their precarious legal position, the offer is inadequate. The Double K Ranch is worth approximately $18 million, according to their own sales contract with Pinnacle Development. Mr. Vance is the rightful owner. Why would he accept $3 million for property worth 6 times that?" "Because," Whitmore said smoothly, "even with the evidence Mr. Chen has presented, litigation could drag on for years. Appeals could extend this well beyond Mr. Vance's lifetime. The emotional and financial cost of continued legal battle may outweigh the benefit of uncertain victory." "There's nothing uncertain about this," Chen countered. "The charter is legitimate, the lease expired, and your clients knowingly concealed that fact." "The law is unambiguous." Judge Morland held up a hand. "Mr. Chen makes a fair point. Mr. Whitmore, your clients are offering roughly 17% of the property's established value to settle a case where they appear to have no legal standing whatsoever. That's not a serious settlement offer. That's an insult." Whitmore's composure cracked slightly. "Your Honor, my clients have invested millions in improvements to the property over 4 generations." "On leased land," the judge interrupted. "Improvements made to leased property don't convey ownership. That's basic property law. Your clients had 99 years to convert their lease to ownership through proper legal channels. They were explicitly advised to do so by their own attorneys. They chose not to. Now they want to pay pennies on the dollar to fix their mistake?" Kenneth stood abruptly. "Your Honor, with respect, this is our family's legacy. Our great-grandfather built that ranch from nothing. We've poured our lives into it." "Sit down, Mr. Kendrick," Judge Morland said firmly. "You'll have an opportunity to speak during the hearing. Right now, this is a settlement conference, and what I'm hearing is that your side isn't serious about settling fairly." Kenneth sat, his face flushed with anger. The judge turned to Caleb. "Mr. Vance, would you like to respond to the settlement offer?" Caleb stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom on him. Chen had prepared him for this moment, had coached him on what to say if a settlement offer came. But now, standing here, he found himself speaking from the heart instead of from script. "Your Honor, I'm a simple man. I've worked with my hands my whole life. $3 million is more money than I ever dreamed of having. But the Double K isn't just about money to me. It's my home. It's where I spent 32 years with my wife. It's where I plan to spend the rest of my life. The Kendricks took that from me when they threw me out 4 days after I buried Sarah. They offered me 2 months severance and told me to be gone by the end of the week." He looked across the aisle at Kenneth and Marcus. "I don't want your money. I want what's legally mine. What's been mine, my family's, for over a century. You're right that your great-grandfather built something there, but he built it on land he was leasing from my great-great-uncle. He knew that. Your grandfather knew it. Your father knew it, and both of you knew it. You just hoped nobody would ever find out. Caleb's voice grew stronger. I'm not accepting $3 million to make your problem go away. I'm not accepting any amount of money to give up land that isn't yours to buy. The Double K Ranch belongs to the Vance family. It always has. And I'm taking it back. A murmur ran through the courtroom gallery. Judge Morland gavelled for silence. Well then, she said, I think we're done with settlement discussions. Let's proceed to the hearing. The next 3 hours were a blur of legal arguments, document presentations, and testimony. Richard Chen systematically dismantled the Kendricks case, presenting the charter, the payment records, Jeremiah's letter to Henry Kendrick, and, most devastatingly, the trunk documents showing deliberate concealment. The Kendricks' attorneys tried to argue adverse possession, but Chen countered that the possession had never been hostile. The Kendricks had been paying lease fees, acknowledging the Vance ownership through payment. When Whitmore tried to claim good faith, Chen presented the 1993 legal memo warning about fraud and the 2010 emails discussing, keeping it quiet. Margaret Halloway testified about finding the charter, verifying its authenticity, and tracing Caleb's lineage back to Jeremiah Vance. Her testimony was thorough, professional, unimpeachable. Walter Brennan, the retired judge, testified about the similar case he'd presided over 20 years earlier, establishing precedent for how such disputes were resolved. The Kendricks' side presented their evidence of improvements and investments, tax payments, and property maintenance. They called character witnesses who spoke about the family's contributions to the community, but none of it addressed the fundamental legal question, did they own the land or not? By mid-afternoon, Whitmore was grasping at straws, arguing that stripping the property from the Kendricks would be an unjust enrichment for Caleb, who hadn't contributed anything to its current value. Chen's response was surgical. Your Honor, Mr. Vance has contributed 32 years of his life to maintaining and improving the Double K Ranch. He's worked harder and longer for that land than either of the Kendrick sons, who visit twice a year and collect profits from land they don't own. If we're discussing unjust enrichment, perhaps we should calculate how much profit the Kendrick family has extracted from property they had no right to sell, develop, or profit from. Judge Morland listened to closing arguments from both sides, then sat back in her chair, steepling her fingers. I'm going to make my ruling from the bench, she said. This case, despite all the legal maneuvering and emotional appeals, is actually quite straightforward. We have clear documentation that the Double K Ranch was leased, not sold, to the Kendrick family. We have evidence that the lease expired 32 years ago. We have documentation showing the Kendrick family was aware of this and chose to conceal it rather than resolve it legally. And we have a legitimate heir to the original owners presenting a valid claim. She looked at the Kendrick brothers. Your family has been good stewards of the land. That's commendable. But stewardship doesn't equal ownership. You were tenants on a long-term lease, and that lease expired. The fact that your father and grandfather chose not to address this legally doesn't change the fundamental reality. She turned to Caleb. Mr. Vance, the court finds in your favor. You are the legal owner of the Double K Ranch and all property therein. The Kendrick family's counterclaim is dismissed with prejudice. They have 60 days to remove their personal effects from the main house and vacate the premises. The courtroom erupted. Kenneth was on his feet, shouting something about appeals. Marcus sat frozen, his face ashen. The gallery buzzed with excited conversation. Judge Morland gavelled for order. The Kendricks are free to appeal, of course, but I'm issuing a preliminary injunction against any sale or transfer of the property pending appeal. And given the evidence of knowing concealment, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation of potential fraud. She looked at both sides one final time. We're adjourned. Caleb sat very still, trying to process what had just happened. He'd won. The Double K was his. Legally, officially, finally. His. Richard Chen was shaking his hand, congratulating him. People from the gallery were pressing forward. Tommy and the other ranch hands, Frank Morrison from the feed store, old friends and neighbors offering their support. But Caleb's eyes were on Kenneth and Marcus, huddled with their attorneys, their faces masks of defeat and fury. They'd lost everything they thought was theirs, and while justice had been served, watching them crumble gave Caleb no pleasure. He thought of Sarah, buried on the eastern ridge of the ranch that was now his to protect and pass on. He hoped she understood why he'd fought. He hoped she forgave him for the pain this had caused her brothers. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was warm on his face. Camera crews called questions, but Chen steered him past them to the parking lot. "You did it," the lawyer said. "You actually did it." "We did it," Caleb corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, without Margaret, without all those people who believed the truth mattered more than money or connections. What will you do now?" Caleb looked east, toward where the Double K lay beyond the horizon. "Go home," he said simply. "I'm going to go home." The 60 days passed slowly, each one heavy with anticipation and strange emptiness. The Kendricks filed their appeal as expected, but their attorneys had advised them privately that the chances of overturning Judge Morland's ruling were minimal. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the law too clear. Caleb spent those weeks preparing. He met with accountants to understand the ranch finances, reviewed supply contracts and cattle sale agreements, and consulted with the other hands about operations. The Double K was his now, but he'd never run an entire ranch operation before. He'd been the foreman, the manager of daily tasks, but ownership brought responsibilities he'd only observed from a distance when Sarah was alive. The ranch hands had voted unanimously to stay on. Tommy spoke for them all when he said, "We know this place. We trust you. And frankly, we're glad to see someone running it who actually knows what end of a horse does the work." Kenneth and Marcus avoided the ranch during those weeks, sending moving crews to pack up the main house. Caleb stayed away while they worked, giving them space and privacy. Whatever anger he felt toward them was tempered by understanding that they were losing the only home they'd known, even if they'd never truly owned it. On the final day, exactly 60 days after Judge Morland's ruling, Richard Chen arrived at the ranch carrying a leather document folder. Inside was the official deed, transfer, signed by the county clerk, stamped and sealed, transferring full ownership of the Double K Ranch to Caleb Vance. "This is it," Chen said, handing the document to Caleb. "You're officially the sole owner of 12,000 acres, the main house, all outbuildings, water rights, and mineral rights. Congratulations." Caleb held the deed carefully, feeling its weight, not just the paper, but what it represented. Generations of history, a century of struggle and secrets. The fulfillment of Colonel Jeremiah Vance's expectation that his descendants would one day reclaim what was theirs. "I never thought I'd hold something like this," he said quietly. "Never imagined I'd be anything more than a hired hand." "You were always more than that," Chen replied. "You just didn't know it." They walked together to the main house. The moving trucks had left that morning, taking the last of the Kendrick family's possessions. The house stood empty now, echoing with absence. Caleb had been inside countless times over the years, but always as an employee, never as an owner. Now he walked through rooms that were his by right. The grand living room with its stone fireplace. The dining room where Sarah had grown up eating Sunday dinners with her family. The library where her father had kept his books and conducted ranch business. Everything personal had been removed. The walls were bare of photographs, the shelves emptied of books and mementos. What remained was just structure, walls and floors and windows, waiting to be filled with new life. "What will you do with it?" Chen asked. "I don't know yet," Caleb admitted. "The foreman's cottage is enough for me. This place feels too big, too empty. But maybe," he paused, thinking, "maybe I'll invite the hands to use it. Turn it into a kind of bunkhouse for the crew. This ranch has always been about work and community. Seems right to keep it that way." They walked outside to the front porch, looking out across the land. The afternoon sun painted everything golden. Cattle grazed in distant pastures. The mountains rose purple against the sky. It was the same view Sarah must have seen every day of her childhood, the same land her great-grandfather had developed, believing it was his. A car appeared on the long driveway, a sedan moving slowly, as if reluctant to arrive. It pulled up to the house and stopped. Kenneth emerged from the driver's side, alone. He looked older than he had 60 days ago, the fight and anger drained from him. He climbed the porch steps slowly, stopped a few feet from Caleb. "I came to return the keys," Kenneth said, holding out a ring with several keys attached. "Main house, barn, equipment shed, everything." Caleb took the keys. "Thank you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Kenneth said, "My father, he was a good man in most ways, but he made a mistake. A big one, and he taught Marcus and me to perpetuate that mistake rather than fix it." "I know," Caleb said simply. "Sarah," Kenneth's voice cracked slightly. She would have told us to do the right thing, to face the truth and deal with it honestly. We should have listened to her more when she was alive. Maybe if we had... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She loved you both, Caleb said. Despite everything, she loved you. And she loved this land. I'm going to take care of it the way she would have wanted. Not as revenge or as victory, but as responsibility, as stewardship. Kenneth nodded, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. The appeal. We're withdrawing it. Our attorneys say there's no point. And honestly, I don't have the stomach for more fighting. You won fairly. The land is yours. He turned to leave, then paused at the top of the steps. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for how we treated you after Sarah died. You deserved better. She would have been ashamed of us. She would have forgiven you, Caleb said. Eventually, that was her way. Kenneth walked to his car without another word. Caleb watched him drive away, dust rising behind the vehicle until it disappeared from view. Richard Chen put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. How do you feel? Caleb looked down at the deed in his hands, then out at the land stretching to the horizon. Like I'm home, he said. Finally, truly home. The first thing Caleb did as the official owner of the Double K Ranch was ride out to the eastern ridge where Sarah was buried. He brought flowers, wild flowers he'd picked from the meadow, the kind she'd always loved, and a small wooden sign he'd carved himself. The sign was simple, just 3 lines of text burned into a smooth pine. Sarah Kendrick Vance, beloved wife. She knew what mattered. He set it into the ground beside her headstone, making sure it was level and secure. Then he sat in the grass, as he'd done so many times before, and told her everything. We won, he said. Or I won, I suppose. Though it doesn't feel like winning. More like justice, like things finally being set right. Your brothers withdrew their appeal. Kenneth came by to apologize. Not for everything, but for enough. I think he's starting to understand what really happened here. What his father did. What they all chose not to see. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal. Caleb watched it for a moment before continuing. I'm going to change some things. Not everything. The ranch still needs to be a ranch. Cattle still need to be worked. Land still needs tending. But I'm making the main house into housing for the hands. Nobody should have to live in those cramped bunk houses when there's a perfectly good house sitting empty. And I'm setting up a trust, like you always talked about, to make sure this place stays working land, not luxury home sites. The Double K will be a ranch long after I'm gone. He touched her headstone, the marble warm from the sun. I miss you every day, every single day. But I think you'd be proud of what I'm doing. I think you'd understand why I fought. It wasn't about the money or even really about the land. It was about standing up for what was right. About not letting people treat others as less than. You taught me that. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. Caleb sat there until the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Finally, he stood, dusting off his jeans. I'll be back, he said. I'm always back. This is home now, really, truly home. The next morning, Caleb gathered all the ranch hands in the yard and made his announcement about the main house. The younger men were thrilled. Private rooms instead of shared bunk houses, a real kitchen instead of hot plates and microwaves, space to spread out and live like human beings instead of transients. There's one condition, Caleb said. We all take care of it together. It's not a free ride. It's a shared responsibility. We keep it clean, maintain it properly, respect it. This house has history. It matters. We honor that by treating it right. They agreed enthusiastically. Within a week, the house was transformed. The hands moved in, bringing their few possessions, personalizing their spaces while respecting the shared areas. Tommy took the room that had been Kenneth Jr.'s, hanging up pictures of his family and the rodeo belt buckles he'd won in his youth. Manuel claimed the library, filling the shelves with books about ranching, animal husbandry, and surprisingly, poetry. The house came alive again with sounds of laughter, conversation, the clatter of boots on hardwood floors, the smell of coffee brewing in the morning and steaks sizzling in the evening. It felt right. It felt like what Sarah would have wanted. Not a museum to preserve the past, but a living space serving the present. Caleb himself stayed in the foreman's cottage. That was his home, his place with Sarah's memory, and he had no desire to change it. But he ate dinner at the main house most nights, sharing meals with the crew, listening to their stories, offering advice when asked, and silence when that was better. Frank Morrison from the feed store stopped by one afternoon, bringing a gift, a new sign for the main gate. It was beautifully made, carved wood with metal trim, and it read, Double K Ranch, Estant 1895, Vance Family Legacy. Figured you needed something that told the truth, Frank said, helping Caleb install it on the gate posts. The old one just had the brand. This one has history. They stepped back to admire their work. The sign looked perfect, substantial, and honest, telling anyone who drove through that this was Vance land. Had always been Vance land, would always be Vance land. Thank you, Frank, Caleb said. It's perfect. You've done good here, Caleb. Real good. The whole town's talking about it. How you stood up to powerful folks and won because you had the truth on your side. That matters. That means something. To people who work for a living. After Frank left, Caleb stood at the gate for a long time, looking at the sign, then at the ranch stretching beyond it. He thought about Colonel Jeremiah Vance, who'd claimed this land over a century and a half ago and never got to see it prosper. He thought about all the Vance descendants who'd worked other people's ranches, never knowing they had a legacy waiting. And he thought about Sarah, whose death had seemed like the end of everything but had actually been a strange kind of beginning. The sun was setting, and Caleb had evening chores to do, cattle to check, equipment to secure, 100 small tasks that made up the daily rhythm of ranch life. But first, he allowed himself one more moment just to stand there, to feel the weight and wonder of ownership, of belonging, of finally being exactly where he was meant to be. He touched the new sign once, feeling the grain of the wood, the solidness of it. Then he turned and walked back toward his home, toward the foreman's cottage where Sarah's quilts still covered the bed and her teacup still sat on the kitchen shelf. The Double K Ranch was his, and he was the Double K's. Bound together by history, blood, justice, and love, exactly as it should be. 6 months later, on a morning when spring was just beginning to warm the Montana air, Caleb stood on the porch of the foreman's cottage watching the sun rise over his land. The coffee in his hands steamed gently, and somewhere in the distance cattle were lowing as the hands moved them to fresh pasture. The Double K had settled into its new rhythm. The main house bustled with life. 5 ranch hands and a new cook Caleb had hired, a widow from town named Ruth, who made the best biscuits he'd ever tasted and kept the house running like a well-oiled machine. The cattle were healthy, the equipment maintained, the finances stable. The ranch was thriving, but more than that, it felt right, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together after being scattered for too long. Margaret Halloway had visited last month, bringing news that the Montana Historical Society wanted to feature the story of the Double K in their quarterly journal. It's a remarkable case, she had said. How often does property return to its rightful owners after more than a century? How often does justice prevail over money and power? People need to hear stories like this. Caleb had agreed to the interview, though he'd been uncomfortable with the attention. He'd told the historian the same thing he'd told everyone. This wasn't about glory or revenge. It was simply about truth and home. Richard Chen had called last week with final news. The district attorney had decided not to pursue fraud charges against Kenneth and Marcus. Too much time has passed, Chen explained. And honestly, I think the DA felt they'd suffered enough. They lost their family legacy, their inheritance, their reputation. Criminal prosecution felt like overkill. Caleb had been relieved. He'd never wanted to see them imprisoned, just wanted what was his. Justice didn't always require punishment. Sometimes it was enough just to set things right. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Kenneth had taken a job in Denver, something in commercial real estate. Marcus had moved to Seattle, working for a tech company. They'd landed on their feet, as wealthy men usually did, but they'd lost something irreplaceable in the process. Caleb didn't celebrate that, but he didn't mourn it either. It simply was. The sound of a truck coming up the drive pulled him from his thoughts. He recognized it immediately. Tommy's beat-up Ford, though it was earlier than the young man usually arrived for work. Tommy parked and climbed out, carrying something wrapped in canvas. His face was bright with excitement. "Morning, boss. Got something to show you." Caleb set down his coffee. "What is it?" "Remember when we were cleaning out that old storage shed behind the barn? The one that's been locked up for years? Well, we finally got the door open yesterday, and look what we found." He unwrapped the canvas to reveal a painting, old, dusty, but remarkably well preserved. It showed the Double K Ranch as it had been in the 1890s, the original small cabin before the main house was built. Cattle grazing on open range, and in the foreground, a man standing beside a horse. The man was tall, weathered, wearing a military uniform and a stern expression. At the bottom of the painting, in faded script, were the words, Colonel Jeremiah Vance and the Double K, 1894. Caleb's breath caught. This was him, his great-great-uncle, the man whose land this had been, whose decisions over a century ago had led to everything that followed. The man looked strong, determined, but there was something else in his eyes. Sadness, perhaps, or weariness. A man who'd seen too much war, lost too much, but was trying to build something lasting. "I thought you'd want to see it," Tommy said. "Figured it belongs with you." "It belongs in the main house," Caleb said. "Over the fireplace, so everyone who lives here and works here knows the story, knows where this place came from." They carried the painting to the main house together. The crew helped clean it carefully, and Manuel, who'd been a carpenter before becoming a ranch hand, built a proper frame for it. By afternoon, Colonel Jeremiah Vance was hanging above the stone fireplace in the living room, watching over his land once more. That evening, Caleb invited everyone to dinner. The hands, Ruth, Margaret Halloway, who happened to be passing through, Frank Morrison from town, and a few other friends who'd supported him through the ordeal. They gathered around the long dining table, sharing food and stories, laughter filling the house. After dinner, as people lingered over coffee, Margaret raised her glass. "A toast," she said, "to Caleb Vance, who proved that truth and justice still matter in this world, and to Colonel Jeremiah, who built something that lasted far longer than he ever knew." Everyone drank, and Caleb felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with whiskey. This was what he'd been fighting for, not just land, but community. Not just ownership, but home. Not just legal rights, but the ability to gather people together in a place that mattered, that had history and meaning and purpose. Later, after everyone had gone home and the house had quieted for the night, Caleb walked back to his cottage. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting silver light across the ranch. He could see the main house with its warm windows, the barn where Tracker and the other horses dozed, the distant pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, all of it his. All of it whole again after being fractured for so long. He touched the ring in his pocket. Sarah's ring, which he carried always. "We did it," he whispered. "Your home is safe. Your land is protected. And I'm still here, Sarah. I'm still here, doing the work, honoring what you loved." The wind answered, gentle and warm, carrying the scent of grass and earth and possibility. Inside the cottage, Caleb placed the ring on the nightstand beside their bed, beside the family Bible with its records of births and deaths, beside the photograph of Sarah smiling in the sunlight, beside all the small tokens of a life fully lived. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more of the endless tasks that defined ranch life. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb felt complete. Not happy, perhaps. Happiness might be too much to ask after such loss. But content, settled, home. He looked out the window one last time, seeing Colonel Jeremiah's painting illuminated in the main house window, the old soldier watching over his land as he'd always intended. The Double K Ranch had come full circle, returning to the family that had founded it, carried forward by a man who'd earned his place through sweat and love and an unwavering commitment to truth. And that, Caleb thought as he finally turned in for the night, was a legacy worth protecting, a story worth living, a home worth fighting for. The end of one chapter, and the beginning of everything that came next.